I want to introduce you to the moderator of the first session, Dan Gorenstein. So come on up. We can all make room. I'll stand over here. Dan is the founder and executive editor of the nonprofit health policy news organization Trade-Offs. Thanks, Dan. Dan's bringing his computer up here as well, so I don't know what to make. I don't know what to make of that. Are you gonna? Thanks, Tony. You're gonna report. You're gonna be a report from the stage. It's all right. That's good. So Dan, thanks for being here. Of course, I'm now looking for. Yep. So Dan's podcast is like must listen for many people in the room. Ceci in particular is like, you gotta listen to this one. I hear this all the time. Before Trade-Offs, Dan was senior healthcare reporter at Marketplace. Spent 11 years at New Hampshire Public Radio. Started in journalism at the Chicago Reporter as an investigative journal that examines race and class disparities in the Chicago area. I can't wait to hear more about that someday. Many awards, congratulations on all of those. And founded Trade-Offs, and this is great, with the goal of helping America have smarter, more honest health policy conversations. And that is exactly what our goals are with these sessions and why we're here today. So Dan, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Tony. Really appreciate those remarks. Thank you, Kaiser Permanente, for having me and the panel here. This is going to be a really exciting session. I just want to say that it's really cool to be in this room with a lot of people. The people who are in this room are here because you either really care about this issue or you want to learn more about this issue. And I believe over the course of the day, you're going to be in a position to actually acquire information and knowledge, which is exciting. And beyond that, you have an opportunity. Obviously, there are people on the panels who are experts, but the people who are in this room are also experts. And you all can look to each other as a community of people who are actually grappling with, in one way or another, you might not all be on the same page, but you all care about this issue. And that's an opportunity to learn and grow with something that is truly a very perplexing, difficult to solve issue. And it's exciting. So with that said, I'm going to dive in. Tony, thank you so much for those remarks. It is really, you're right. We're here to have an honest conversation. It's hard to have honest conversations, but that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to do a little tee up here. If you are new to Trade-Offs, we're a nonprofit newsroom that covers healthcare's toughest choices. And our panel's job is to first give you kind of crash course in our country's approach to pricing drugs. Though I guess the word approach makes things sound a little more strategic and rational than they actually are, as you're about to hear. So buckle up. We've got some great panelists who are going to introduce themselves shortly. One thing we do not have, though, is someone from the pharmaceutical industry on this panel, so I'm going to try to some degree to wear that hat. Just want to call that out in advance. Before we jump in, I do want to start by acknowledging how powerful medications can be. I think this must be said. I think most people in here know this. We're talking about products that have saved millions of lives during COVID, that have cured hepatitis C, turned some cancers into chronic conditions. And right now, they're in the midst of transforming how we treat obesity. We all agree, I think, that we want a system that rewards these sorts of innovations, and to some extent, our system does, but it also does a lot of other wasteful and harmful things as well. So with that, panelists, I'd love for you all to introduce yourselves. Let's keep it short and quick. Christy, we'll start with you. Cool hair.
Thanks. Thanks to Kaiser Permanente for having us. My name's Christy Martin. I've been in DC for a little over 20 years working in health policy. Last 10 years or so, I've been working in drug pricing policy, and it's been a lot of fun. I've done some things like Medicare drug price negotiation, and I'm really excited about the panel.
Hi, everyone. I am Lee Purvis. I've been with AARP for about 20 years. I am the prescription drug policy principal, which is a lot of P's. But what it effectively means is that I am responsible for AARP's policy around prescription drug issues. And that can go from anywhere from drug pricing to FDA issues to Medicare Part D. So a lot of different issues kind of fall under my umbrella.
Hi, I'm Tahir Amin. I'm grateful to be here, so thank you for having me. And I am an intellectual property attorney that qualified in the UK, worked in the commercial side, so I can also wear that hat too, occasionally, but I've thrown that hat away. I look at the intersection, or my organization, which I co-founded, the Initiative for Medicines, Access and Knowledge, looks at the intersection of patents or other types of IP and their impact on drug prices, and why we keep seeing these ever-increasing prices due to the practices of the business.
Great. Thank you for introducing yourselves. I want to start, Christy, we're going to start with you. In as much as this panel is meant to be kind of like a 101 on why we have the drug prices that we do, I believe you have a slide. I know you have a slide. We've talked about it, prep calls. You have a slide to help get us oriented to some of the kind of key inputs that shape the drug prices we pay in the U.S. So at the highest level, please stay out of these weeds, Christy Martin. I know you love them. Can you give us a kind of 30,000-foot view of the system that we currently have?
Yeah, drug pricing policy is not for the faint of heart. And I think a lot of times we try to, Tony kind of talked about this, we try to boil it down to something simple. Like there's one thing we can focus on and we can fix it all. But the problem is it's very complex and interconnected pieces where you have to really think about how's the system working and then think about, well, what changes can you make to the system and how could that help to lower prices? And one piece of it is research and development, innovation. Basically, how are we incentivizing the development of drugs? How are we thinking about new drugs coming to market, talking about what those are going to mean for the public? And that can turn into overuse and abuse of patents, which is what we're have going on in the system today. Public funding of a lot of the research and development, and that is contributing to a lot of the drugs that are coming to market. And so if public funding is going into them, why are we paying so much? And some people say, why are we paying double? We're helping to develop them as taxpayers, and then we're paying high prices on top of it. The second part is the supply chain, and Tony mentioned this a little bit. It's really disjointed. There's a lot of people that are in the mix of the supply chain, a lot of intermediaries, the lack of transparency, and all these things push prices up. Everybody's kind of like in the interest of having higher prices. So when you have a lot of players, a lot of lack of transparency, they're going to want to have higher prices. And then the third piece is how we talk about coverage and payment and access. And I think this is actually where we spend maybe a little bit too much time. The end part of it, how much is Medicare paying? How much is Medicaid paying? How much are patients paying? Oh, is there a copay cap? But at the end of the day, we have a very fractured system of who's paying what. We have different prices. A lot of times we don't know what the prices actually are. We have delayed price competition where we could actually have lower prices. And Tony mentioned, lack of having value frameworks and what are fair prices, what is value. So there's a lot of problems that we can tackle here and a lot of different pieces of it. But at the end of the day, any part of this could help to lower drug prices.
Christy, just a quick follow-up question. You said that sometimes you think we end up spending maybe too much time on this third input, the payment, coverage, and access. Why do you think we spend too much time on that piece?
I think because that's where the patients really feel it the most. You see patients get sticker shock over what their coinsurance is or what they're paying at the pharmacy counter. And so easy political win is a copay cap, is an out-of-pocket limit. And we saw that with the IRA in particular with the $35 insulin copay cap. And we also saw it with the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap. Yes, we should be helping to make it financially more stable for patients to afford their drugs over time. But what that does is it actually makes premiums higher. So they're still paying for it. They're just paying for it in a different way. It's not lowering the cost of the drug itself.
And one more on this. Is it harder, as a reporter, I would say it's been much easier for me to report on payment, coverage, and access than it has been to report on the supply chain and this sort of tension between R&D and innovation and those incentives. Is that part of this as well? Just harder to see this part of the system?
I think it's the players involved. You have a lot of industries that are in that space, and they're holding their cards close to the vest. There's not a lot of regulation in the supply chain. We don't know a lot about what's going on with wholesalers, except for the glimpses that we get. Same thing with PBMs. And like then we have the things like the PSAOs and the GPOs and all these different entities that are basically
Careful now with these
intermediaries.
acronyms.
But I think this is part of it, right? Like it's hard to report when you have all these entities that have a financial interest and nobody can really dig into them because we don't have enough transparency.
Thank you. And so this slide, so for the people in this room who are new to this slide is really a great, I think, crash course. Do you agree?
Well, it's mine. Yes, of course I agree.
Okay. Thanks for that. Let's zoom out into one particular problem area here, and that's patents. Patents are this really important. I think many of the people in this room know, but I apologize. I want to be really clear about this. I'm reading these questions. These are sort of long. I'm giving a lot of background. A lot of people in this room probably know what I'm about to say, but some may not. And I've learned a long time ago that you want to make sure you're talking to the people in the last row of the class, not just the front row of the class. So with that said, I don't know who knows what, so I'm going to be a little bit slow for some of you. So I apologize in advance, but I hope that I'm going to be able to bring a couple other people along. So patents are this really important way that we incentivize innovation. We reward pharma for the risks they are taking investing in new drugs. With this monopoly period, when no competition can enter the market, they reap all the profits. But these patents are also one of pharma's best tools for keeping competition at bay. And in the US, since we don't regulate prices, competition really is the fastest, best way to bring prices down. But patent abuses have become a major barrier to competition. To hear you've been studying patents for a long time and the games that companies play with them. To be a bit more concrete, a good case study of the problem and how ultimately it affects the prices that we pay, which is one of the questions that people talked about at the top of things that people are interested in hearing about today, is these GLP-1s, the case study with the GLP-1s, the Wegovy's, the Ozempics, the drugs that help people manage diabetes, lose weight, and treat heart problems. You've written a report on this. As you say in the report, the drug maker of Wegovy, Ozempic, and Rybelsus, is that how you pronounce it? Rybelsus, is Novo Nordisk, and they've had two key compound patents originally filed in 2006. To hear, just to kind of give people a sense of Novo, what has the company done since 2006 when it comes to patents?
Yeah, just to add on, just as an introduction, I'd love to just get a sense of how many patents do you think should exist on a drug or exist on a drug? Just to show just quick numbers. That you think would exist on a drug. But for somebody who doesn't know, is anybody who hasn't read these books? You're in front of the class, but anybody who really has no idea.
How many How many people in the room think a typical drug has 10 patents or less? Okay, got a handful. How many people think a typical drug has 50 patents or less? A lot more. How many people in the room think a typical drug, and by the way, I have no idea the answer, Tahir does. How many people think a typical drug has 100 patents or less? Okay, Tahir, hopefully that sets you up a little bit.
So when we look at the study we did, we looked at the compound, which is semaglutide, which goes into Ozempic, Rybelsus, and Wegovy, and what we found, and these are by no means like the actual figures because there may be more. With patents, there's so much obfuscation. You have to read through reams and reams of pages, the science behind it. As a lawyer, what we used to do is deliberately use words so that people can't actually identify what the patent is about. So that even examiners at the patent office are sort of perplexed when they're trying to examine these things. But what we found was Novo Nordisk had filed 320 patent applications on this one active ingredient. We may have 3 different products, but it's the same active underlying ingredient. And of those, they've been granted 154 patents. Now, when we look at some of the poster childs of patent abuse, if that's the term we're going to use, Humira, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, pretty much holds that title, where we found some over 300 patent applications. They've over 165 patents granted. And it was a very successful business model for AbbVie, where they were able to keep competition off for 7 extra years beyond their main expiring patent. And in just that 7 years, they made $114 billion. That was more than they made in their first 13 years of their original patent life. So that's just to give you a sense of what these numbers mean and why these companies play this stacking up of patents, or the term that we use in the field, the patent thickets that they create, because what they are essentially are landmines for the competitors. You have to navigate through all these different patents to try and enter the market. And what inevitably happens is you get bogged down in litigation, and we end up with settlements. And when we end up with settlements, it means you've got 2 corporate actors who are deciding when a drug will enter the market in a competing form.
So let's stay with Novo for a second here, and I encourage everybody to check out this IMAC report, which Tahir certainly can make available for anyone in the room. So in 2006, Novo files 2, and this is at the highest level. I'm going to get the technicalities wrong, but they filed 2 key compound patents. Those, and they get 20 years of exclusivity. So in theory, these 2 patents should expire in March of 2026, less than a year from now. One of them will, and one of them won't. One of them will now expire in 2032. Can you explain, let's just keep this specific to Novo, because we just want to have this nice case study here. What has Novo done to be able to extend the life of one of these 2 key compound patents, and why does that matter? What are the repercussions of this?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and keep this really non-technical, because
Please.
Dan has encouraged me not to get too wonky.
Encouraged. I'll whip them with my pen.
Actually, Novo Nordisk never did anything. They have benefited from a system that was created in the 1980s that was designed to bring generic drugs into the market. It's a law called Hatch-Waxman. And that law was essentially, it was a trade-off, if you might say. It was basically, we're going to allow generic companies to not have to do all the clinical testing, so that they can do just a bioequivalency, which is basically a comparator test with the original product, and then generics can enter. You know, they can actually challenge the branded company's patents. And that was the deal. But the drug companies were saying, well, we're losing some of our market monopoly. We want something back. And one of the things that was given to them or guaranteed to them was what we call a patent term extension. So this is where basically, due to regulatory delays, if their drug is going through regulatory approval, there's delays, it eats into your life of your patent, that 20 years that you talk about, Dan. So, for example, by the time you get approval, you've maybe only got 10 years of that patent life left. And so drug companies were saying, well, that's not fair. We're losing life. We know we're busy in the lab trying to get this drug to market. We've got regulatory delays. We want some of that time back. So what, in its wisdom, Congress said, we're going to give you up to 5 years back. So basically, what it turns out is companies can get up to 14 years of patent exclusivity. So your patent life gets extended for 14 years. And in this case, instead of March 2026, this 20-year patent term coming to an end, Novo Nordisk, just that one patent, not all the others that I'm talking about, the 154, that comes after, they're going to basically get that extended. They've had it extended to 2032. So this is what the current statutory laws provide. Novo Nordisk never did anything. The drug companies back in the day did something. They lobbied for this, and they got it. And that 5 years for Novo Nordisk, by our calculation, it's a conservative estimate, it's worth $166 billion just on those 3 products.
And then on top of this, and we're going to move on here, but I just, again, this is an illustration in real time of drugs and how companies use patents to their advantage to extend their monopoly. So we've got these other 154 patents that you talk about. What is the consequence of this? So basically, Novo will have this exclusivity until 2032, but then potentially, if I'm just looking at my notes here, based on your patent searches, Novo has been granted 49 follow-on patents providing protections until 2042. So what are the implications of that to here?
So the implications are, for example, Wegovy is essentially what they've done, they changed the dose. So some of these other patents are allowed them to switch out this product into Wegovy for the weight loss. So that potentially, we don't know if we know on Ozempic there has been a settlement between one generic company and Novo Nordisk. We don't know when the generic will be able to enter. Some think it's 2032, but those documents are confidential. We don't know what the terms and conditions are. And I'm not going to get into what settlements can do or not do, but that's potentially, we might see Ozempic as a generic in 2032 when the sort of main patent comes off. We might. It may be a couple more years because they've got all these other patents that they may, drag it out for. Interestingly, in Canada, Ozempic is going to go generic next year because somebody forgot to file the renewal fee for the patent. So that's an interesting conversation that's been going around in the circles. But in other countries, in India and Brazil, you're going to see generics in 2026, according to that 20-year term.
And one final question here, putting the industry hat on. If Novo were here, they would certainly argue, look, we have put this work in, we've invested this money, we deserve these extra protections. We are actually really, our product is making people healthier. We're extending lives, we're improving the quality of lives. We deserve this. What would you say? Again, look, I feel I'm sad that there's not somebody from industry here who could articulate this better, but can you help? So what would industry be saying in response to what you've said?
So the common back and forth is we've invested money, we've brought new uses, different indications for these different drugs. They're looking at sort of how to decrease alcohol consumption, the cardiovascular. It's a Swiss Army knife, the semaglutide drugs.
Right, this could help with drug addiction.
Yeah, could help numerous uses. And so the argument is that we wouldn't invest in those if we weren't able to have those patents. That's the argument. Now, the last time I looked, and it may have changed, well, it has changed, is you don't get a patent for investing. You get a patent because it's new, novel, and it's not something that is obvious to someone in the field. But unfortunately, we've turned the patent system into this reward for just investing. So what we're doing is, and I'm going to put it bluntly, we're giving away what is knowledge that should remain now in the public domain is being reprivatized over and over and over again. And the reason it's working that way is because the drug companies are using what is termed in the economic field as financialized business model, which is they're driven by the financial sector demands, their quarterly reports, their CEO salaries, they're all tied to stocks and dividends. And just one last point, all this talk of R&D, if you look at Novo Nordisk figures, they spent 41% more on share buybacks and dividends, so basically enriching their shareholders than they did on R&D. So this whole notion of we need that money to put into R&D is a fallacy.
There are a lot of people from the industry perspective who will say that is not a fallacy. You worked in the industry. What evidence, in quotes, do you have to really kind of like further make this case that this is in fact a fallacy?
So, for example, if I'm a patent applicant for a drug company, and when I file the first patent, I will list out in my original patent, in that first patent, I will often list out what are the potential indications that drug could be used for. And then what I do then is I file another patent on that same indication, that same potential new indication, and I'll say, well, I dosed it at 20 milligrams. Are you telling me that's new? That's what's happening. Humira, AbbVie did that. Keytruda, that's exactly what's happening with Keytruda. If you look at Keytruda, it's got, I've lost count how many indications it's got.
41.
41. This is, I mean, there are books written about this. There's a book called Life Cycle Management in the Pharmaceutical Sciences, and I can't remember the page exactly. I'll send it to you if you want. And they literally say we have to exploit every loophole. This is a business practice. And I did this as a lawyer. What you're doing is you're always looking for a way to extend your fence, get more protection. Because each year, some drugs, one day can earn you $50 million. So one day of extra patent life is worth a significant amount to these companies. And that's why we get all these patent games.
And Dan, if I could just add,
Please.
I mean, there's what they say. This is the frustrating part for me. There's what they say.
They, the drug makers.
Yes. And then there's what they report in their SEC filings and their shareholder calls. And that's where we get the information about what's their investment on R&D. How much are they doing stock buybacks? How much are they, paying their CEOs and their executives? And it's really frustrating when they say oh, well, we're going to have to cut R&D, or we're not going to be able to invest in small molecule. And then they turn around and make a deal to buy a small molecule company. And it's right there in their SEC filing. And I think that's going back to what Tony said earlier, drug pricing is political. And that conversation is happening very much here in DC, but the conversation that's happening on Wall Street is a different conversation.
I want to bookmark that because I'm curious. We'll get to this in a couple of questions, but I'm really curious about whether or not Medicare being able to begin to negotiate drug pricing is connecting the conversations in Washington to the conversations in New York. But let's pause on that. Lee, I'd really like to bring you in. You've been very patient here. So hopefully people in the room at this point have some reasonable overview of some of the current system that we have, as well as some of the key flaws that lead to why we pay the higher prices that we do in the U.S. Let's trace the ripple effects, Lee, that these prices can have on our health system, in particular on patients. A recent poll by KFF found that almost 1 in 3 adults had failed to take a drug as prescribed by their doctor due to cost concerns. So 33% of adults saying can't afford it. You wear a couple of hats, as you said. One of them is representing consumers and advocating for their concerns around drug costs at AARP. What have you learned from that work, Lee, about the toll that these high prices can take on people?
Yeah, I would say there's a really clear reason why AARP has been so engaged on this issue, and it's because high prescription drug prices and their costs, the related costs, are something that resonate with pretty much everyone that we represent. And when I say that, I mean going back decades, survey after survey showing 90% support or higher for doing something about high prescription drug prices, 90% or higher support for solutions for high prescription drug prices. And, at least in today's day and age, it's very hard to find any issues that have that kind of across the board appeal for people in this country. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that they're also incredibly well qualified to be talking about this issue because they take a lot of prescription drugs. So on average, Medicare beneficiaries are taking between 4 and 5 prescription drugs per month. And they're often taking them on a chronic basis. So we always try to point out, this is not someone having a bad year. This is someone who is facing these high costs every year for the rest of their lives. And as Christy mentioned, until recently, there was no limit on how much they had to spend on their prescription drugs. And so we would be hearing about people who are taking particularly expensive ones, who are spending upwards of $10,000 per year just on those drugs, which I don't think anyone in this room could afford, but you're really going to have a hard time affording it if you're on a fixed income and you have limited savings. And so that is leading to trade-offs. Where people are having to choose between things like paying for their food or their rent and paying for their prescription drugs. And we have, at this point, a very robust story bank from people who have had to make those tough decisions. And we also are very mindful of the fact that, yes, we are incredibly concerned about the people who are currently struggling, but we also know that pretty much everyone we represent is one expensive prescription away from being in the exact same boat. So this is not something where we're, only working on behalf of the people who currently have those high costs. We want to make sure that other people do not face those choices in the future. And for us, it's really going back to what we're putting people through. Like, you already are sick. And now you're having to scramble to try to figure out how you're going to pay for a prescription drug that get the treatment that you need. And that, for us, is obviously something we don't think anyone should have to choose between.
Lee, I know you have a personal story that you're going to share in a second here, which I want to get to, but I have a kind of communications question, I guess. I've been a healthcare reporter now for about 15 years, and over those 15 years, I've heard a lot of people in positions like you saying, oh, there are all these people who've got to make these tough choices. It's either, they're either going to pay for their prescriptions or they're going to pay for their food, or they're cutting their pills in half. We have been hearing these stories for a long time. They don't really seem to resonate, do they? Do these stories, Matt, you talk about this robust story bank, do these stories matter?
I think they do, and it kind of goes back to what Christy has said, where there have been efforts to try to constrain those costs. Like, we are seeing a lot of interest in copay caps. We're seeing a lot of interest in out-of-pocket caps. But again, going back to Christy's point, that's only one side of the affordability challenge here, right? Like, you are going to see those costs pop up elsewhere, and that could ultimately make healthcare coverage unaffordable. So you really have to address both sides of that problem, which is the cost and the price. And the more people understand the challenges, hopefully they don't have to get to the point where they themselves are experiencing kind of those challenges with affording the drug they need.
And again, before you go to this personal anecdote, I'm wondering if you have a Capitol Hill anecdote you can share. I'd be fascinated to know. Have you ever shared a story with a member and it's mattered?
I can't say that I personally have. I can say that AARP has a lot of people, a lot of volunteers who go to the Hill and do share those stories, and they absolutely have resonated. There is a reason that we have been able to be pretty effective on this issue, and it's because we were able to personalize it. So yes, I do think those stories do have an impact when policymakers are face to face with someone and hearing about what they're going through.
And so, can you now share with all this buildup? Can you now please share the personal story that you've experienced that really will give a very granular sense of what this looks like as it plays out?
So full disclosure, when we were prepping for this, I mentioned a personal story, and I realized as I was thinking about it, I am not sure I'm going to hold it together through that one, so I'm going to give you a different story because I have talked to a lot of people over the years. People are very invested in what they're going through and making sure people understand. And so I have talked to a lot of different people about a lot of different things. And so the story that I am going to share speaks to a trade-off, but it speaks to the less polite one. Normally when we talk about trade-offs, we're talking about food or rent, right? But sometimes those decisions really are much more difficult. There's always this assumption that people are going to find a way, and that's not always the case. Sometimes these drugs are so expensive that there's absolutely no way that people can pay for them. So several years ago, I was approached by a small group of women who told me they had metastatic breast cancer. So for those of you who aren't aware of that, there is no cure. It is a life-limiting diagnosis. And they told me they knew that there were drugs available that could help them or potentially help them, but they were so expensive that they couldn't pay for them. And so then they confessed that they took some, let's say, jaw-dropping risks. And I'm not going to say any more because for all I know, they're still doing it, but some jaw-dropping risks to just get access to these drugs. And then others were just
jaw-dropping risks like what? Just give an example here.
Let's say they were operating outside the healthcare system. So they, or in other instances, they were so expensive that they were just completely going without them. And so it's heartbreaking when you talk to patients like that because they should have been focusing on the time they had left. Like, these are terminally ill people who, instead of getting access to the drugs that could maybe help them, they're going to these risky workarounds. Or they're saying, I don't want to leave my family bankrupt, so I'm going to refuse to try this treatment option. And those are the stories that I think are really important to keep in mind when we're talking about this debate, because food and rent is one thing, but sometimes it's actually a life or death decision. And there are absolutely people out there who are making those decisions.
And I'm not gonna, obviously I'm unable to compel you to share the story that would make you cry, perhaps. But I want to at least ask you, what is it about the story that you don't want to say that makes you almost cry? Journalism at work.
Trying. All right. So I will say that this personal story dealt with someone who also was terminally ill and had been doing incredible work around prescription drug pricing as an advocate. And her treatment stopped working. And so she got prescribed a new drug. And the first thing she did, rather than looking at what the drug could do, the chances of it, she called me and said, "Can I afford this?" And that to me was just, it's a lot.
What happened?
She passed away.
Was she able to afford the drug?
No.
I appreciate you going here. I'll stop with the questions about the story, but I appreciate you going here because I think in some way it illustrates that this actually happens. Like, we can talk about patents and we can talk about numbers and billions of dollars here, millions of dollars there, Medicare, drug negotiation, these things that sort of exist in the ether, but we're talking about people who are literally walking out the street right now who are struggling, who are not able to afford their drugs and are dying.
Unfortunately, that is the reality of the conversation we are having. And given the trends that we're seeing in prescription drug prices, the unfortunate reality is we're going to see more of it.
Another place where we see fallout from these high prices is among payers, the employers and insurers who pick up most of the tab for these medications. Of course, the biggest payer, the biggest purchaser of all is the federal government. Medicare alone spends more than $200 billion a year on prescription drugs. $200 billion. One big reason that historically Medicare has paid so much is that they haven't been able to directly negotiate their own prices the way many other countries do. That's clearly begun to change due to the Inflation Reduction Act, which did begin to give Medicare this power. Christy, you have helped oversee the team leading these historic negotiations. What did you, Christy Martin, someone who's been thinking about drug prices for a long time, what did you personally learn from this process? What do you know now that you did not know before?
I think a few things. I think the first is that Medicare can negotiate drug prices, period. Like, they did it. It's possible.
The sky is not falling.
Yeah, it's fine. We're okay. Like, drugs are still available.
And before, because the rhetoric before was,
oh, we pulled the drugs off market. Like, we won't be able to exist as a company. There won't be any new drugs coming to market. They won't have any new indications on them. I mean, you name it, right? They're going to be pulled off formulary. So far, so good. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, too, is that we talked a little bit about the rhetoric here and, that's going on with the pharmaceutical industry about how the sky's falling. But when they actually showed up in the room, for the most part, that's not how they behaved. They were very much there for the task at hand. And I think, you had a couple that would show up and it would be like the most awkward family dinner you've ever experienced, where they brought the energy of like, I'm just going to sit here and stare at you as long as I can and not make it a very productive conversation. But then you would have the ones that would come and they would be they'd be the dinner guests that would be like, oh, I'm going to come with stories. There's those people who are like, they're always going to be like, oh, I'm going to come prepared with my anecdotes. And so there was like one company in particular that every time they showed up, they had new analyses that they had done, like custom analysis and data that they had run that was like Medicare specific. They had done, they had taken data that wasn't published and had shown the team that. They really were there for the game. They were like, we're here to negotiate. And I think that led to a better negotiation process ultimately for them. And I think they understood that's what they were there for. So I think, not only was it possible, but it could actually be a really effective negotiation where both sides felt like they were coming to a place where maybe it was a win-win. They were going to get something out of it. And ultimately, for the drug companies, they do get something out of this. And this goes back to, we have some that are going to face competition in the next year that have been negotiated. But these 10 companies are guaranteed to be on formulary, even if their competition comes to market. So they get another year squeezed out, that they are insulated. So, they get something out of this. And I think some of the companies actually realize that.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, what does you talk about like a good negotiating process. What does a win-win look like?
Yeah, so there's a couple of like features that were designed in the law to kind of like frame up the negotiation process. One of those was setting a ceiling. And the ceiling was meant to be kind of like, what is the top of the range that the negotiation could be set for? And then there was essentially a floor that was set by CMS. And so that gave you kind of like the bookends that you were negotiating between. And, for the ceiling, it was either the lowest of what they were currently offering in Part D, or a highly discounted price based on how long they'd been on the market. And so for companies that had been on the market a very long time, that either had very little brand-to-brand competition, or they were in the protected class. So there's 6 classes of drugs that are required to be covered by Part D, all the drugs in that class. So they don't have any like incentive to negotiate their prices. They're not really rebated. And so for those drugs, that actually put downward pressure on it so we could get a better price. But even from there, we were able to negotiate down from the ceiling on every drug. We were able to push down even farther. And I think that when the win-win comes is that, we heard from almost every single CEO, not all of them, and you can probably guess which one we didn't hear from, but almost every single CEO commented on that the team was professional, that the team was well prepared and demonstrated expertise, meaning our negotiation team, that they felt like that they were given a fair shake. And some of them, the public explanations that came out after the negotiation was done, they also wanted to see certain things in those public documents, because we talk a little bit about, like what's fair, what does value mean? And for some of these companies, their competitor was also being negotiated. So they were very much aware that Medicare, the largest payer in the country, 1 out of every 5 healthcare dollars is a Medicare dollar, might say drug A is better than drug B. And I think they know that. They know the power of Medicare has to influence a market. And they know that there might be something that could come out of this process where they could gain a competitive advantage over a competitor.
And that's an incentive for them to come to play ball.
I think for some of them, it is. I think some of them are like, I see how the tea leaves could play out. I'm going to read these tea leaves in a certain way. I think for some of them, like the one CEO that didn't call, they are like, I'm not going to play any game. Like I'm a profit maximizing company. I'm going to do everything in my power to protect my profit. So, every company is different. Every negotiation was different. Going into this next round, the team's negotiating right now. I anticipate they have 15 different negotiations going on, because of the nature of the drugs, because of the nature of the companies. But, it was interesting to see it kind of play through and see how different the companies were responding and reacting and what they were responding to. And you could see them working through like, okay, I understand that how this could be to my benefit or might not be to my benefit.
Do you feel like having sat in on this process, you have a better, one of the things that a lot of people in the audience said they really want to get at, right? We heard this word, and you start your opening comment was about this word too, solutions. And you said, and with your slide, there are too many things. There's not one solution here. But I'm really curious, Christy, as a result of sitting in on these negotiations, helping build this process, do you feel our nation has inched forward in terms of what a solution beyond Medicare may look like?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've been talking about Medicare negotiation and prescription drug prices for 40 years. So the fact that we got it was a huge shift, I think. I think not just an incremental shift, that was a huge win. And I think now you're seeing a
huge win for?
I think for American taxpayers, to be honest. I think for people in Medicare, I think for the Medicare program, I feel that advocates in particular have been, since we started talking about prescription drugs potentially being covered, retail prescription drugs potentially being covered by the Medicare program in the 1990s, there's always been a conversation that Medicare should negotiate those drug prices. And it's just been an uphill battle. And then we finally got to the top of the hill, you know, and I think now we're just getting started. And there's conversations going on about, well, should these prices be available, you know, I would love for this to happen, be available to people who are uninsured, right? Should this be, if you're self-pay, do you get the Medicare price? Or should it be extended to commercial payers? Should it be expanded? Should we be doing more than 15 or eventually 20 drugs a year? Should we be negotiating earlier? You know, I've even heard there's some conversations, which I think these are different. These are conversations I don't think we could have had 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Should the U.S. be thinking about their own health technology assessment system, which is how Europe and Canada and other countries kind of assess fairness or value. But Medicare's trying to do a little bit of that within negotiation with like assessing clinical benefit and the information that's being sent in as part of the negotiation process. And I feel like our conversation around it is changing. I also feel like there's been an acceptance that Medicare is negotiating. You know, there's the litigation and the lawsuits, but I've been pleasantly surprised that unlike the ACA, which I also worked on implementing, we haven't had a broad campaign to repeal negotiation. I feel like that has actually been the biggest surprise to me in all of this, that people haven't been like, oh, we should just repeal the whole thing. They're wanting to tweak it, but not repeal the whole thing. And I think that's because we've changed the conversation.
I want to ask you. We're talking, and we'll get more into these sort of as we wind down. We're going to have 10 minutes for questions. So please start thinking about the questions you all have. Cue those up. I'm really excited to hear what other people in the room are thinking and what you want to ask this esteemed panel here. But Christy, we're talking a lot about FAIR. We're starting to talk about FAIR and value and what that looks like. And again, bird's eye view. It's super cool that you're here. So few of us are ever in the room. Being able to talk to somebody who's in the room is very exciting. What is fair? This seems like the question at the core of all this. How do you find a price that rewards the sorts of innovations we all want while also preserving access? What's a story that you, from the negotiating room, that illustrates what's hard about finding fair? So I'm actually not looking for I was asking you a minute ago about win-win. I'm now asking you a story about like, we sort of didn't quite get there. We want to illustrate what's hard, because it's easy to say let's get to a fair price, but that's got to be hard as hell.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. And I think, it's figuring out how to translate some of the data that is coming in. And there's definitely some examples of, we had data coming in and it was more clear cut that a drug lowered hospital readmissions, which means it ultimately lowered Medicare spending somewhere else in the program, which sounds great. But how do you think about translating that into a reduction in price or an increase in price? And the team took a very qualitative approach. So there wasn't like a formula that you plug things into and it spit out a number. But they took a very thoughtful, qualitative approach where it was like they were trying to think about how to weight things appropriately, how to weight the different pieces. And even with like, we took the approach, and I think this is another great example of, we wanted to take into account real world data, real world evidence, and experiences of patients and caregivers. And so we had these listening sessions. There's pros and cons to those. We can get into that anytime. But one of the things that the team heard that I think really resonated with them, there was two stories in particular. One was a woman who came on, and she was not Medicare age. She was probably maybe in her 40s or something. And she was on one of the drugs she had a chronic disease. She had been on a number of therapies pretty much her entire adult life. And she went through in 3 minutes, which was pretty miraculous. She went through every therapy she went on. And she said, this therapy, I was able to work. This therapy, I was not able to work. This therapy, I was able to have a child. This therapy, I was not a good parent. But she really kind of talked about like what it meant for her personally in her life and the life she wanted to live. And that really struck a chord with the team because they were like, oh, that helped to bring to life some of the data that we were getting in through the quantitative process. And then another story that really, I think, affected them too was...
Wait, before you go to the second story, so what I'm hearing you say there is like the team began to understand that one of the ways we assess for value is trying to understand the patient perspective on the quality of life. Two drugs can sort of work equally well in terms of treating the underlying disease, but if one carries lots of side effects, even if that's the cheaper drug, but people can't work or parent or whatever, then that drug actually has less value.
Yeah, and I think and this gets to kind of part of our problem with some of maybe our FDA system. When you look at clinical trials, if they're using surrogate endpoints, two drugs can have the same results, same clinical results. But when you put them into people, that it can look even like the same drug can look different in people, especially when you're talking about biologics. And I think the team, very much were like, okay, we need to think about how to take that in consideration.
And the team did.
And the team did, yeah.
Okay, so that was the first story. Sorry, the second story.
Second story was a doctor that came on and was talking about how she went through kind of the shared decision-making experience with patients and going through kind of like different drugs and things that she talked about with her patients and figuring out which therapy was the right therapy for them. And I think the way she kind of talked about and asked the questions, cost was part of that, but the way she talked about the things that she considered, the team found that was also helpful because that's how it's actually affecting people in real life. And I think to get back to, Lee's point earlier about, when it comes down to it, all that matters is like trying to get the right drugs to the right people at a price that they can afford. Those are the things that, through this negotiation process, we're really trying to incorporate and consider.
And was there at any point the team came up with a price that it felt was fair and the drug maker was like, what are you talking about?
I mean, yeah, of course, the initial price. So the way the process worked, we had the initial offers that went out and the manufacturers had to respond to the initial offers and either accept the initial offer or provide a counter offer. They pretty much all said no to the initial offer. So yeah, of course. I mean, that's part of it too, is that, we just knew there was going to be a back and forth. There was a starting point and then there was going to be this back and forth. I think we were really proud that we did get to a point where we accepted 5 offers from the manufacturers because we felt like they fell within the range that we felt like was fair. And that we had 5 manufacturers that accepted the prices that CMS offered.
Okay. Lee, you're on the board of another leading organization that's grappling with some of these same issues, ICER, or the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. For folks who do not know, ICER publishes widely cited and highly anticipated reports assessing the prices of different drugs and whether or not they are fair. They collect all sorts of evidence and input from a wide range of stakeholders. In some ways, Lee, ICER is doing work that happens inside of governments of many other countries, where they actually have groups dedicated to figuring out fair prices. One of the classes of drugs I know that ICER is evaluating is these GLP-1s. I'm curious if you could use the example of these GLP-1s and share with folks what makes figuring out the value of a drug sometimes harder than it sounds.
And before I jump into that, I want to start off building on something that you said, which is noting that other countries are already doing this. Because I think one of the biggest challenges that's facing efforts to try to figure out a fair price or a best value price is that there's been a lot of effort put into making it seem like it's impossible or making sure it doesn't happen at all. And I think Christy's given some great examples of the fact that it is happening here in this country. ICER is another great example. But again, you look globally, and these types of assessments are already happening. So if nothing else, please take away the fact that this is not an impossible task. The question is not whether we can, it's whether we will. So specifically back to the GLP-1s, and specifically to the population that AARP represents, I think it's a really good example for how complicated it can be to look at a drug. For example, for older adults, the data is really evolving. And there's not a lot on older adults. And that makes it really difficult to figure out what this drug is doing. Oftentimes, older adults were excluded from the clinical trials that evaluated safety and efficacy. So how do you take a look at a drug that hasn't really been evaluated in the population in question? A lot of the studies have focused on weight reduction. And for older adults, that can actually be problematic because you can lose muscle mass, and that's protective for older adults. So is that the same type of effect that you want to see for older adults? Another issue that's come up is adherence. A lot of times people will take these drugs kind of off and on, or they'll take them and they'll gain the weight back. And that raises questions about what sort of idea you have of what these drugs are actually doing because they're not being used in the way that was intended. And the other question kind of goes to those questions of whether it's sustainable. You know, is there a long-term effect here? And if not, what does that look like in terms of the drug's value? And then there's another question about the savings. CBO has taken a look at these drugs specific to the Medicare program and said they're going to cost us a whole lot more than there's going to be an offset in healthcare spending. And so how do you add that into the equation? And then going back to what was mentioned earlier today, these drugs are being used to treat a lot of conditions. How do you build that into the equation? And then, of course, the elephant in the room, the number of people that could be taking these drugs. You can have a fair price and have it still be unaffordable if a third of the population is taking it. And so that's something else that needs to be incorporated into this. And now that I've said all of that, I do want to go back to the point. It's not impossible. Other countries are making these types of evaluations. But it's very easy to poke at how complex it is to try to make the case that you shouldn't be doing it, and that absolutely is not the case. We do need to have kind of those transparent, evidence-based conversations, but it is absolutely possible to do it.
What's an example from ICER where you had one of these very difficult conversations and it proved, in your mind at least, to be worthwhile?
So as a board member, I do not get involved in ICER's day-to-day work, to be clear. But I am privy to conversations where they are having these types of discussions. And the one thing that I can say that ICER has been very good about is bringing in the patients to have these conversations. When they first started doing this type of work, they got a lot of criticism, justified or not, I'm going to say unjustified, but unjustified or not, that they weren't incorporating the patient perspective. And they have gone above and beyond to make sure that they are capturing the sort of information that patients want to be included in these types of analyses. And again, have gone out of their way to make sure that they're taking that broader perspective that I think everyone wants them to take.
And what about the perspective of the drug makers?
They are also there. So interestingly enough, when ICER takes an expansive view, I think it's safe to say that they take an expansive view. So everything from patients to the drug companies to the payers are in the room to have conversations about what their evaluation should include. I remember the first time I really came across ICER's work in a meeting, they noticed me when I was sitting in this large group and they were talking about all the things they'd done, bending over backwards to make sure that they were accommodating all of the criticisms that had been levied against them. And I stood up and I was like, you guys are not going to have time to do the actual evaluations if you continue going down this road. You've got to make sure you're doing the actual work. And they were like, thank you. And so, yes, I would say they have done an incredible job of making sure they've been responsive to the criticism that had levied against them.
Do you feel like the existence of ICER has helped sort of socialize the conversations that sort of led up to Medicare price negotiation?
I absolutely do.
Why do you think that? Because
the evaluations that the research that they've been putting out for years now, and the transparency within those reports have made it seem it's not been subject to the fear mongering that you might see if someone just said this organization came out with this fair price, and that leaves a lot of openings in terms of whether drug companies can make a case that is unfair. But they again have gone out of their way to be transparent in how they've done this, and that has allowed other entities to take a look at what they're doing and potentially build on it.
This is a question to all three of you. I mean, it seems like, in my mind, whether it's the ICER work or the Medicare price negotiation, this is bringing more transparency. And as a result of more transparency for all the stakeholders, including industry, including patients, including payers, there is less fear now. Does that strike you as right? Tia, we haven't heard from you in a while.
I think from the perspective that we look at on the patent side and basically what patents mean to the industry, there's a lot of fear. The blowback we have received personally is by showing this transparency, by revealing these numbers, the practices that the companies have. This underlies it basically it's what they build it's the platform for what they build everything off. And so at least in the patent space, there's a lot of fear because they feel the floodgates are going to open, and I feel they have opened. I feel the change we've seen over the last 7-8 years, the way the media is covering patents. I mean, in my time looking at this issue for 20 years, I see a story about patents every day now, which I only thought I'd ever see in India when I was working there. But to see that here in the West, in the United States, is actually it's a sea change. And the fact that the other side is really worried, as one person in the philanthropy world said when we were talking about impact, he said, if they're going after you, that means you're doing something right. So I do believe that things are changing. I think there are more people talking about these issues that they never saw before. Maybe because the prices have, as Tony said in his opening speech, the prices have gone up so dramatically. And that's why people ask the question, what's behind it? And seeing all these pieces now being revealed, I believe has started to really get people sort of not only angry, but we've just done a survey which we'll be revealing soon. And one of the response, it was kind of like a KFF survey, a really big survey. It's not just it's a real big number which we'll be revealing soon. And the number one thing that the respondents were really upset about was corporate greed. And actually, second to that was they believe that there needs to be patent reform. Now, we would never have seen that 5-10 years ago. So that, for me, shows that the conversation is changing.
Do you either of you think that there's less fear?
Absolutely. I think the fact that, to Christy's point, there's been no political movement towards getting rid of Medicare negotiation is telling. It kind of came all at once, and now it's here. And I think people are seeing that the sky is not falling, regardless of where the assessment is taking place. I think people are seeing perhaps the drug company positioning is slightly overblown. Perhaps there is some fluff in the system, and you can have lower drug prices, and it is possible to negotiate those lower prices. And I think the other thing that's important that's happened directly because of negotiation is that people are starting to become more comfortable with the idea of large-scale negotiation. Like, that didn't exist before. And so there are comfort levels growing with a number of different changes that have happened because of IRA. And that is help improving people's comfort level with the idea of what's happening behind the scenes to get them the lower prices that they want.
I think it's interesting. I think the industry in particular, I think they've shifted. I think a couple, it's interesting. Like, my mom's a good barometer. She lives in Western Kentucky. I grew up in a very small town. And she called, I don't know, maybe a month ago. And she was like, I was watching the 6 a.m. local news. What's the pill penalty? And I was like, okay. I was like, well, let's call it the biologic bonus, and I will explain it to you. And, so there's still...
Can you explain?
Yeah, so... In the negotiation framework, drugs become eligible for negotiation if they're a small molecule, so like a tablet or a pill, at 9 years, at 9 years on market. And if they're a biologic, so a large molecule, at 11 years on market. And so there was a push, it's called the EPIC Act, to actually shift the 9 to 11 so that the small molecule and the biologics would have the same, number of years that they have to be on market before they're eligible for negotiation. So it was giving small molecules extra time on market before they become eligible for negotiation. And it would end up hurting Medicare's negotiation savings over time, and then not getting as many drugs in for negotiation early. So I explained it to her, and she's like, oh, so it's bad. And I was like, yes. And she's like, so I should email Brett Guthrie. And I was like, yes. But I think that's they've shifted, right? Maybe they've realized that their tactics that they had been using since the 1980s of you're going to kill innovation. I remember Henry Waxman, when I was working for him, had me go and dig and find the transcript for a hearing that was held in 1983 where they said, you're going to kill innovation. And he's like, they've said this before, go find it. And I had to go find it. And it was like verbatim. You know, they're moving away from that messaging, and they're trying some different tactics. So I feel like it's changing. I feel like they realize that they're not in the same position. They don't have the same power. They're not seen favorably as much as they were anymore. They've defined their enemy as PBMs now. So they're going after a different industry. You know, so I feel like there's a shift. I think one thing that everybody should be very cautious of is, I think it's very easy that now we have Medicare negotiation and some of the other changes that have happened over the last few years to sit back and say we've done good work and we're addressing drug prices. But now's the time to push even harder than ever. I feel like PBM reform, patent reform, there's so much more that we can do to get ahead of this and to actually bring drug prices down for everyone. And for me, I think negotiation was just a tipping point of where we could be going. So, you know, I think perseverance here is really important. Kind of going back to where we started, you know, all those pieces of the system we need to be working on in order to get to lower drug prices.
Very good. That takes us, this timing is fairly impeccable. As an old radio guy, I love talking to the clock. Time for y'all's questions. We would love you to, there are microphones here. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself quickly, and ask the question. And be mindful that other people might want to ask questions, so please have your question be a question rather than a monologue, which I'm sure people in this room are prone to.
Yeah, don't give a... Okay. Oh, so you got to be careful. You just gave it to a politician. So I'm the state senator, Denny Taveras from representing Maryland. So we just finished passing HB 424. So just to Chrissy's point, I believe, we just finished passing a prescription drug affordability board and setting up a price limits. So, and we included negotiating or at least conferring with the state's medical assistants to make sure that we weren't, disrupting the market too much. But the question that I have is that I was having a conversation. I don't know, I won't mention the company, but the thing is that if we really wanted to have a negotiation regarding lower costs and on prescription drugs, the person said to me, when I said to them, it's like, look, we're doing this in other countries. A lot of you mentioned that. Their answer to me was, yeah, but those countries have the market leverage. They have universal health care. They've got the market to come in. We don't. So the question is, what's the resolution to that?
Thank you, Senator, for your question.
Don't promote me.
We have the market leverage. We have one of the biggest, if not the biggest, pharmaceutical market in the world. Yep. We cover more lives. We have more people living here taking drugs than any other market. So that's one. And Medicare alone, there's 65 million people. Keep in mind there's connection points, and I think you raised a good one with the prescription drug affordability boards. Those state boards, a lot of them are picking up the Medicare negotiated prices and incorporating those. So that means those prices get extended to the states. On top of that, the Medicare negotiated prices are getting incorporated into Medicaid, sometimes replacing Medicaid best price. So that's extending to the 100+ million people in Medicaid getting those prices. So we have the negotiating power if you give it to Medicare, because the way it's all connected at the end of the day. And, if you looked at the first version of the Medicare negotiation framework in HR 3 that passed the House in 2019, it was having them negotiate for the commercial market. So I don't think that's an excuse not to do it. I think that, there's plenty of negotiating power with Medicare, and I think Medicare, you're going to see those prices show up throughout.
If you are a lawmaker at the state level and you're having a conversation with someone from industry who says this, what advice would you have for the state senator or someone else, state representative, not to out you too much?
Yeah, so, I think that it's that.
What's the pushback?
Yeah, that there is negotiating power with the government. They represent taxpayers. There's 300 million plus taxpayers. So yes, they do have the negotiating power, and they do have the ability to put those prices and set them and make them available for folks.
And kind of what we're seeing with the PDABs, of course, is you see an expansion of the patient pools, right? So who's covered under it. And
watch that acronym, explain that.
Prescription drug affordability boards, when states have decided to really get involved in prescription drug pricing, kind of like what Medicare negotiation is doing. You're seeing states trying to expand those populations as much as possible. And sometimes you'll see state purchasing pools. There's bulk purchasing. Like, there are a lot of different ways that states can work together. And that also is a really good opportunity to help get down those costs. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind for negotiation is that the prices that resulted are public. And for those of you who are not fully immersed in this world, like, public prices is a really big deal when it comes to prescription drugs. And that can be used as a basis for negotiations by other payers. And so now there's a new kind of threshold that people can use. And that's another really important leverage point for states to have. Saying, Medicare is getting this price, I want something better, I want the same. That kind of conversation can finally happen.
One final quick follow-up on this. What are 2 or 3 resources state leaders could tap to help them as they think about this for themselves at the state level?
I would say one resource is the National Association of State Health Policy, NASHB. They've been helping to support a lot of the state prescription drug affordability boards. You have probably in Maryland one of the best state advocates I can ever imagine, in Benny DeMarco, who's been helping a lot of other states set up their affordability boards. But NASHB's done a really remarkable job in trying to help to push this along and doing a lot of the technical assistance. So I'd say that's one. I don't know if you have one too.
Not to throw ICER under the bus, but I do think that they also are available for those types of conversations if you want to really start thinking through whether prices can be negotiated further.
Thanks so much. We have about 4 minutes here.
Hi, my name is Carmen Witzkin. I'm with the Alliance of Community Health Plans. I just want to ask, I would love to hear your thoughts on Part B drugs being selected for 2028 and how the kind of greater impact we might see in lowering costs that way, or how patients can actually see those lower costs affect them, and because we are introducing the whole next level of the hospital system in those negotiations.
Yeah, so Part B are the physician-administered drugs that are covered under the Part B outpatient benefit or under Medicare Advantage if somebody is enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan. The Part B drugs will come up for selection next year with prices going into effect in 2028. Part B is always going to be a smaller proportion of the drugs selected because they're just not as big of spenders. There's just a lot more people taking the drugs in Part D. The Part D spending is just a lot higher. And the selection is really based on how high spending gets. So you're always going to see more Part D drugs, but you will start to see the Part B drugs. And I think when it comes to people, individuals, there's a couple of things that are really important. One, negotiating lower prices. Right now, the way it works is that the co-insurance or the cost sharing for a prescription drug in Part B is based on a 20% co-insurance of the average sales price, which is a commercial price, and the payment for Medicare to the provider. If Medicare negotiates below that, which they will, then it would be 20% of that price. So you'll see cost sharing go down, which is fantastic. That could actually save Medicare money in the long run. So you could see some suppression on Medicare spending in the long run, which would also be fantastic. You would see that float over into the Medicare Advantage as well in a couple of different ways. And this is where it gets really, really technical. But if Medicare spending goes down, then you would hopefully see some suppression on Medicare Advantage side as well. But I think that it's going to be really interesting when the Part B drugs come in. The Part B drugs are very different. They're really concentrated in a couple of different spaces: oncology, rheumatology, ophthalmology. most people have some type of supplemental coverage to cover their cost sharing, so they're not as exposed to some of the cost sharing with these drugs as they may be in Part D. And I think that because the way we reimburse these drugs in the U.S., meaning providers or hospitals purchase the drugs and then Medicare reimburses the provider for those drugs, create some operational challenges that CMS, they haven't put out how they're going to handle some of those complications, but they have some complications that they're going to have to work through. They have time to do it, but it's going to look and feel different than the drugs that were negotiated last year.
We've got 1 minute left, and I'd like to give the panelists each 30 seconds, so we'll go over by a couple seconds here. Final thoughts, something that you really want this room to be thinking about right now. Lee, let's start with you.
Sure. So one thing that I've really taken away from how things are shifting right now is that there is finally a little push on drug companies in the sense that we are seeing payers really expecting them to show up at the table with a little bit more information. And we've been seeing that, for a number of years now. We saw it with, granted, there were budget constraints, but the reality is we're seeing payers wanting more. And I think that can only help in the kind of discussions that we are having today. Because if drug companies don't, unfortunately, what we're seeing is payers just deciding to limit access, and sometimes it's very arbitrary. And so it really speaks to the importance of everyone being willing to start having the kind of conversations that will help drive prescription drug prices towards something that works for everyone.
Christy?
I would say, we heard people respond to the survey that they want solutions. I actually think we have a lot of the policy work done in this space. There's so many smart people in this room that I've worked with for the last 10 plus years. Lee's one of them. Here's one of them. But there's others. We have a lot of the solutions. We know what the work that needs to get done. What we need to work on is the political will to do it, and getting the momentum to get Congress to move on it or the administration to move on it. So I would just encourage folks to, roll up their sleeves and, just know that you can do this. And we've done the policy work. We've done the hard part. We just got to do the muscle part, and sometimes that's the unpleasant part.
So here,
I would agree with Christy. There's a lot of solutions out there, but I think we need to change the language. I think for too long we've been using their language, and I think we need to find our own language and how to describe things. And the classic one is what Tony said, that the sky's not going to fall in if you make some of these changes. And anytime anyone says the word innovation, that means financialization.
That means what?
Financialization. That means it's about making money for the shareholders.
Well, with that, let's give it up for this panel.